The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Oh, I think I left off somewhere around Grover Cleveland winning. Oh yeah, because we didn't get to the Homestead strike. So Grover Cleveland wins the election of 1892. Making him the 22nd and the 24th President of the United States. He's the only person ever to have served two non-consecutive terms as president, which is quite significant. And also he is the only Democrat in that period between when you have the Civil War and then finally Wilson wins in the 20th century, so about a 50-year period in which there was only this one Democrat until Wilson. And certainly that can be, you can see that because with the strength of the People's Party, they had 1 million votes in 1892. And you often see that in contentious elections, where if you have a third party that does have some, yeah.
Can you go back?
Sure. That one? Oh, sure. So when you do have a third party that is able to have enough strength and take away votes from the two major parties, it can really upset the election. We'll see this situation that happens later on in an election that deals with Teddy Roosevelt towards the end of this unit. All right, so a little bit about labor history. As you know, as I've talked about, as hopefully you've been reading your book, that the book has talked about, although sometimes I'm a little concerned about people reading the book, because when I was going through some of those vocabulary words, I clearly saw some descriptions when you were filling things. A few people were filling things out that I do not recall being in the book. And so clearly people are, I don't mind if you use the Google things and use online, but you need to double check for what your book is saying and what I'm saying, okay? Because that's the most important. So the Homestead strike is one of the major labor disputes of the late 19th century. I'm going to talk about two of them today. The Homestead strike at Carnegie Steel's Steelworks in which the Carnegie Steel Company was no longer willing to deal with the union. They had broken the union at their other plants, and this was the only one that held out. Andrew Carnegie, of course, had a good reputation amongst his workers. He was always seen as being a man of the people. He was this guy, of course, who had worked himself up from nothing. He had grown up extremely poor, immigrated to this country from Scotland, and so he immigrated from Scotland and becomes one of the wealthiest men in the world. And however, even though he had gained this reputation of being a good guy who was looking out for his workers, he actually really did not like dealing with the union at all. And so he does not want to be the fall guy, though, and take the blame. So his business partner, Henry Clay Frick, actually gets charged with that task of breaking the union. Andrew Carnegie thinks that he will be safe from any type of bad publicity. And what he does is he goes to his castle in Scotland. So he leaves the country, and he feels like he's far enough away on the other side of the ocean that it's not going to be a problem. Paul?
I think then again, most people at that time did not want to deal with the union because they were pushing for something that they really thought that they really did not care for.
So if you were very wealthy and you owned a company, often just like now, they might not want to deal with the union because that's going to cut into your profits. Yeah. But as far as the average worker goes, that's a mixed bag. A lot of people are terrified to join a union because they could lose their job. This has come up before. But certainly workers saw that if the unions were able to hold together, and that it generally was much better if you could get the company to negotiate with you. But the problem was mostly the owners didn't want unions, and they did everything they could to get rid of unions, and there were no laws to prevent that. So there were no laws protecting the workers in those days. And so what happens is that Henry Clay Frick bargains in really bad faith, and it turns out to be a horrible, bloody mess in what happens. Basically, almost like war breaks out between the security, the Pinkerton Guards that's hired by Carnegie Steel, and the striking workers and their families. And so actually this is a little talk, actually very thorough, but very interesting, well done talk that I want you to listen to. And see, it has a lot of great images as well. So, and hopefully it's going to work, since the Wi-Fi in this place is really slow.
We were at the height of the Industrial Revolution. The United States had an insatiable demand for steel, and at the ready to feed this demand were Andrew Carnegie and his Carnegie Steel Empire. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland and immigrated to the United States as a teenager. Carnegie came from very humble beginnings, but he was an extraordinary business person. Through many well-timed and aggressive decisions, he was able to amass a steel conglomerate that controlled all of the elements needed for steel production. At one point, Andrew Carnegie was widely recognized as the wealthiest man on the planet. This wealth did not come by accident. He was a ruthless business person who often exploited labor in an effort to extract more profit. Homestead, Pennsylvania was the site of the labor conflict of 1892. Carnegie Steel was in disagreement with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers over wages at the Homestead Steelworks plant. Their labor contract was set to expire, and they needed to come to an agreement. The public disagreement revolved around the wage scale for employees. However, the true and underlying reason for the conflict was Carnegie's deep disdain for collective bargaining. He resented any union interference to the operation of his company. He built Carnegie Steel, and he saw it as his right to run it unilaterally. Carnegie ruled with an iron fist and was willing to do anything and everything in his power to defeat the unions. Up to this point, he had successfully thwarted union recognition at every one of his steel mills except the Homestead Steelworks. While his intentions are now well known, he was very conscious of public opinion. He did not want to appear to be a strikebreaker or enemy of labor, and instead pretended to be a champion for labor rights. Carnegie was able to successfully forward his personal agenda while shielding himself from public scrutiny by having his plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, impose his will. Frick and Carnegie had much in common. Frick, too, had come from humble beginnings. He had amassed a sizable fortune through heavy-handed management tactics. He used the same management philosophy with the Union, and Carnegie was content to avoid the spotlight in the Homestead matter. Rather than wage a public war, Frick offered a deal that he knew labor could not accept. He bargained in bad faith by offering labor contracts that paid less in spite of ongoing increases to Carnegie steel profitability. He argued that wages should go down when steel prices fall and rise when steel prices increased. Since wages were already low, workers had little incentive to accept his terms. As anticipated, negotiations broke down and Frick prepared for battle with the Union. Frick ordered the construction of a 3-mile fortification to the perimeter of the Homestead Steelworks by building a 12-foot wooden fence around the facility. He even equipped it with barbed wire and an observation deck. It was more akin to a prison than a steel mill. The fortification caused the workers to nickname the facility Fort Frick. Henry Clay Frick preempted the eventual strike by shutting down the entire mill and locking out all 3,800 workers. In spite of this, Union members held a vote and unanimously decided to reject Frick's last proposal and go on strike. The workers anticipated trouble from Frick in the form of Union busters. Under the direction of strike leader Hugh O'Donnell, they set up patrols to search for and thwart approaching replacement workers or strikebreakers. They patrolled the Monongahela River in search of incoming parties, since they knew that it was the easiest way to move large quantities of people into town undetected. In addition to being a Union member, Hugh O'Donnell was a first-generation Irish immigrant who worked in the mills. O'Donnell was clear that he wanted a peaceful strike, but he warned that scabs would be firmly prevented from entering the mill. Frick reached out to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the largest private security force in the country, for assistance. At one point, it was estimated that there were more Pinkerton detectives than U.S. Army soldiers. Frick wanted the Pinkertons to protect the scabs that he planned to bring in. On July 6th, Frick arranged to bring in 2 barges full of Pinkerton agents down the Monongahela River. His goal was to secure the plant and the dock that led to the plant. Once they had secured both, he believed that he could safely bring in replacement workers via the same means. While Frick believed that he could secretly bring in the barges under the cover of darkness, the workers were prepared. Their patrol spotted the Pinkertons as they came up the river and quickly arranged to confront the detectives at the dock. The Union seized the mill by knocking down the fence and rushed to meet the Pinkertons at the foot of the river. As word quickly spread about the incoming forces, the mass of Homestead residents converged upon the river, and their numbers swelled to almost 10,000 men and women. They came armed with any and every type of weapon they could find. As the barges landed, Hugh O'Donnell met the Pinkertons to implore them to retreat. The angry mob grew louder and louder, and O'Donnell knew that there would be bloodshed. He wanted to do everything in his power to avert it. As the Pinkertons began to disembark the barge, a shot was fired. To this day, nobody is entirely sure of who fired that first fateful shot. A melee ensued and chaos took over. Shots rang in from all directions for over 10 minutes. The workers were determined to sink the barges and stop the Pinkertons. They soaked the raft with oil and lit it on fire before they floated it down the river in hopes of igniting one of the barges. They then loaded a rail car with dynamite and rolled it down the hill in hopes of earning a direct strike. They also loaded an old cannon with scrap steel and fired it in the direction of the barges. This effort was not very well coordinated because the cannon inadvertently struck one of the workers as it fired and missed wildly. As both sides suffered losses, they collected themselves to press on. The tugboat that had pulled the barges up the river was loaded with injured Pinkertons and abandoned the remaining detectives in the barges at the end of the river. Stranded and outnumbered, the agents grew increasingly worried and scared. At one point, they presented a white flag at the entrance of the barge, only to have it greeted with more bullets. After 12 more hours of battle, surrender was finally negotiated. The workers promised the Pinkertons that no further harm would come to them. The Pinkertons were unloaded from the barge and led into town. The residents of Homestead lined the 600-yard path on both sides and welcomed the agents with further hostility. The agents were heckled, punched, and kicked all the way into Homestead. They were battered with sticks and stones on their gruesome march through town. They asked for mercy, but the residents were angry and beat them further instead. The tattered and defeated Pinkertons were loaded onto a train and sent out of town. On this same day, the workers set fire to the barges that lay abandoned at the foot of the Monongahela River. In the days after the confrontation, the workers viewed the battle as a victory to their efforts. In their triumph, they rebuilt the wall around the mill and staffed the observation deck to guard against further threats from Frick. They were optimistic that they would emerge victorious in their standoff against Carnegie and Frick. The events that transpired at Homestead were published in newspapers around the country. Public support was divided in both directions. Some were sympathetic to the strife of the workers, while others viewed them as a lawless mob of criminals. When Carnegie received word of what had transpired, he cabled Frick to tell him that he should remain steadfast in his fight and never employ any of the strikers again. He was committed to his victory against the Union and was willing to keep the steel mill at a standstill rather than yield to the Union. Mayor John McLuckie contacted Pennsylvania Governor Robert Pattison to communicate that order was being maintained in town. Carnegie also contacted the governor and exerted considerable political pressure on him to act and remove the strikers from the mill. Governor Pattison found that he had little choice than to acquiesce to Carnegie's demands. On July 12th, 8,500 state militia soldiers arrived in Homestead to enact martial law. They recouped control of the mill and enabled Carnegie to bring in scabs to run the Homestead steelworks. Over the ensuing months, the Union worked desperately to maintain solidarity. In time, charges were filed against the Union leaders for their participation in the conflict. They were charged with conspiracy and murder for the death of the Pinkerton agents. In just 4 short months, the Union started to crumble under financial demands. Union members began to cross picket lines and attempt to get their jobs back. Unfortunately, most of the workers were blacklisted by Frick and were unable to return to their former jobs. They found that scabs that were eager to take their jobs had easily replaced them. The straw that broke the camel's back came in the form of one Alexander Berkman, an anarchist who traveled to Pittsburgh to assassinate Frick on a misguided effort to support the Union. It's worth noting that Berkman's ideology was in striking contrast to that of the Union. They did not invite him to Homestead, nor were they aware of his nefarious plans. Berkman made his way to Frick's office and fired upon him at point-blank range. Berkman had never fired a gun before and failed miserably in his conquest. Frick endured a flesh wound to the neck and recovered in time to return to work the following week. While some were pleased to hear of Frick's injury, by and far, the public backlash was negative. The average American had no idea whether Berkman had acted alone or not. This act effectively nullified any remaining public support for the Union. The remaining strikers voted to return to work and join those who had already crossed the picket lines. By 1893, the majority of the strikers had been rehired on Frick's wage terms. The Union had been defeated.
So, as often happens in the 19th century, the Union is defeated, and there's always more workers to replace those who will not be rehired because they had gone on strike against the company. So Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie get their way. Henry Clay Frick actually is noted as not being a very nice guy, even towards Andrew Carnegie. He sues Andrew Carnegie after he retires, saying he didn't get enough money. And Carnegie actually loses the lawsuit. And Carnegie still wants to be friends with Frick after they're both retired. They don't live very far from each other. They both built huge mansions in New York City. And Carnegie sends Frick a note one day saying, "I think we should get together and talk." And Frick replies, "We can talk all you want when I see you in hell." So, so that gives you an idea of what kind of guy Henry Clay Frick was.
He got shot in the neck for him.
He, what's that?
He got shot in the neck.
Yeah,
for him.
yeah.
I would sue him too.
One of the other major fights of the labor fights of this period comes shortly afterwards, and it's the Pullman rail car company in Pullman, Illinois. It's a company town, just like Homestead was. Primarily, everything is owned by the company, stores, workers' housing, and the Pullman Company had been cutting their workers' pay even before the recession occurred, the Panic of 1893. And the railroad companies had been harmed by the panic, and what you see is Pullman starts to lay off hundreds of their workers, and those that they keep, they reduce their wages even further. But they don't reduce the costs of things like housing, the rents the workers had to pay. So in that respect, the workers are now making lower wages, and yet they're paying the same rates for goods and for their rent. And eventually, the situation gets to be unbearable for the workers, in which they cannot live. Yeah, Paul.
Why did Pullman not lower their rents if he reduced their pay?
Because that would cut into his profits. It's all basically the same old story. Is he would lose money. So yeah, these people aren't very nice. Yeah, so. Go back. Sure. So what you have in the end is that the workers financially can really not afford to live anymore, with their pay being reduced and their expenses being continuing to be the same. And as you know, cost of living in general, I mentioned before in this class, is high at the end of the 19th century. The workers go on strike. The company refused to negotiate. That actually meant that that actually creates a situation in which the railroad union decides to launch a sympathy strike for the Pullman car workers. And so the American Railway Union goes on strike, saying that it will not handle, essentially it doesn't necessarily go on strike, it says it will not handle any Pullman cars. So that meant that 125,000 workers who belonged to the American Railway Union would not help a train that had Pullman cars. And essentially what they did is they brought the nation's rail system to a screeching halt. And then obviously that created a situation nationwide which infuriated businessmen. It actually brings in the federal government to work on dealing with the situation, because the mail had stopped And so with the stop of the U.S. mail, workers, or you have troops sent in actually to Chicago to try to deal with that situation at the rail yard to get the trains moving again, which led to a situation. So this becomes the first nationwide strike. And here you see when the federal troops came to Chicago, because there had been a mail car that had been derailed. And but the rail workers ended up rioting, and they burned hundreds of railroad cars in order to protest, destroying millions of dollars worth of property. This clearly gets a lot of bad publicity. And the strike will be broken. So in the end, the workers don't really get what they want. The strike is broken, but in this case, unlike at Homestead, the company agrees to rehire those striking workers if they agree that they will not join a union. You can actually visit the Pullman site today. It's a historic site. It's a museum. It's one of the best remembered and most famous of the company towns of the 19th century, in which the companies owned everything, and that was a way to control their workers, of course, by owning the whole town. Shortly, so what you have is in this period of the mid-1890s is that you have a horrible economic downturn, which began in the spring of 1893, and it will last for 4 years. It began with the collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad in February of 1893. That just sort of sent some shock waves through the system. It didn't create the economy to collapse yet. But then 2 months later, in April, the gold reserves that the government held fell to under $100 million, creating a situation which the currency was unstable. It was just being spent too quickly, apparently, and so that's why it fell. Yeah, Marches.
That's not one of the terms of it. Would that be on the test?
The Panic of 1893?
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, you should write it down. Yeah. Then the National Cordage Company collapses in May, and that actually May 4th. And this is actually just as the World's Fair had opened in Chicago. And with the collapse of the National Cordage Company, that brings about a panic in the banking system, and because, the whole financial markets just couldn't take all these things happening within a span of only a couple of months. And so banks begin to get nervous. They begin to call in many of their loans because they didn't have enough cash on hand. And in the end, the economy falls into a deep recession or depression, depending on which term you want to use. In the 19th century, of course, they called this a panic. And so the Panic of 1893 lasts for about 4 years. with millions losing their jobs, 15,000 businesses and 600 banks closed, and 200 railroad companies collapsed. This is the worst financial panic of the 19th century. This statistic I want you to remember, so everyone write it down. 20% of the working population was unemployed in the depths of this economic downturn. 20%. It's the most people ever out of jobs. So it was the highest percentage rate ever in the 19th century and the second highest in American history. It's only higher in the Great Depression of the 1920s. And remember, this is at this time that the People's Party is quite popular, that the agrarian revolt is going on, and so there's already been calls for more government, for at least some type of government intervention into people's lives and protecting them against the excesses of big business. Yeah. Yeah, so 20% unemployment rate. It's the highest ever of the 19th century that occurs during the Panic of 1893. There was actually an economist on CNBC about a week or two ago, and he actually gave the wrong statistic for this. For some reason, they were talking about this economic panic, and he gave the wrong statistic, and I was really annoyed because I was yelling. I was like, no, that's wrong. You're telling everyone the wrong thing. So the economy got to be in such a state and was not recovering by 1895. And, of course, there is no government regulation. There's no Federal Reserve at that time. So there's no means in which the federal government can try to help the economy to recover. So what happens is that the government asks J.P. Morgan, one of the wealthiest men in the country, top banker in New York City, to organize a means in which he will personally, along with his other banking friends in New York City, get together and use their financial might to shore up the financial system. And J.P. Morgan does that. So it was actually a private citizen that then has to use his knowledge and his financial backing because of his wide-range business interests and those of his other friends to shore up the U.S. gold reserves. And when they do that, the economy will gradually begin to recover. So, who knows how long this would have taken to recover if someone hadn't done something. So, this is actually the first time, but not the last time, the federal government will come to J.P. Morgan to ask for assistance. It's really quite incredible that you have a situation in which you have a private individual that has more money than the federal government. This is actually another reason why people are more and more coming around to the idea that you have to have a stronger government, federal government. That you can't let a situation get out of hand that gets so far out of hand that 99.99% of the population, including the federal government, has no means to intervene. So, the Panic of 1893 leads to an extraordinary event in which you see the very first march on the nation's capital, beginning in March of 1894, with the large amounts of unemployed people in this country. You see people, unemployed workers, going to going to Washington, D.C. to try to bring attention to the federal government about the plight of the nation's unemployed. And well, like so many instances in the 19th century where the people try to band together to bring about some type of change, it generally collapses in some type of defeat, and this is no different. But it is quite extraordinary that to see that the economy had gotten so bad that you start to see people marching to the nation's capital to ask the lawmakers of this country to become involved to try to help people because, as I've mentioned in previous classes, when the economy got bad, certainly there were charity organizations, often run by religious groups. But in this instance, they were so overwhelmed that private institutions could not help all the people that needed to be helped, because people literally, when situations like this happen, will be thrown out of their homes and are forced literally to become homeless. And there was not enough charities to help people. So literally people do not have enough to eat. They are literally living under bridges, like whole families living under bridges is how bad it gets. Unfortunately, Coxey's army, which is what the march is known as, is met with hostility when they arrive in the capital city, and they are arrested and sent home. So, but this is the first time, and you will see this happening, of course, many times in later generations, and where people do, bring about a lot of national interest and attention to the plight of people. So, although this time failed, it sets a precedent that this is something that can happen later on. So, certainly the currency question comes to a head in the 1890s, and I mentioned the currency question, I think in the last class. Remember, I talked about the issue dealing with hard money or soft money. Hard money being the currency backed solely by gold, but then a soft money or free silver idea, as it was referred to, in which the U.S. currency would be backed by both gold as well as a percentage of silver. And although in the 1890s, on the national level, it gets taken up by William McKinley, who is the Republican candidate for the presidency, and William Jennings Bryan, who is the Democrat, who Bryan is for silver, McKinley, the Republican, is for gold. It's not as easy to break down as often the history texts will tell us, because, yes, often big businessmen like J.P. Morgan, the New York banks, Andrew Carnegie, big, huge corporations, John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, did support a gold currency, backing with gold. It's not that easy. Certainly businessmen in Colorado or Nevada, places where there were silver mines, politicians in states that there were silver mines, whether they be Democrat or Republican, tended to support silver, because if it was going to be good for your local community, then that was what you would support. And so it didn't necessarily always break down on a bi-party basis. That it was more about where you're from. Certainly rural people, farmers, tended to back free silver. I don't know if you recall, but the other day I said that there was this idea in the 19th century that if you had a currency backed with some silver, it would lead to more inflation. That's not really viewed as being true by economists today, but that was the perception at the time. And so small businessmen who borrowed money, and like farmers, would have wanted silver because you could borrow at one point in time, but then if there's inflation, and pay it back several years later. that inflation means that you're paying it back in a reduced currency because of the inflation. And technically, that's better. I've only taken a few business classes in my life, so I'm not a business historian, but that's the belief was at the time. So basically, that's what I'm talking about here in this slide. The hard money versus soft money question will really come to a head when McKinley and Bryan face off in the presidential election. And you'll see William Jennings Bryan make one of the most famous political speeches of all time, known as the Cross of Gold speech. And be sure to make a note of the Cross of Gold speech, because that is so important. And Bryan, by the way, actually will run 3 times as the Democrat and lose 3 times. So he becomes, politically, it becomes very famous because he'll run many times and continually lose. Eventually, by the time you get to the early 20th century and he runs again, there's a campaign later on that'll talk about something like to the effect that, well, don't worry, you can always vote for Bryan. So. Okay. I'm going to move on. So it's in this election of 1896 that I'm talking about, where this whole currency issue comes to a head. Here's McKinley on the left, William Jennings Bryan on the right. And of course, this is the presidential election in which Bryan makes his famous Cross of Gold speech. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's just Bryan and William McKinley facing off in the 1896 election. Try not to get too bogged down sometimes in these slides. Generally, I've already talked about it. Like for this, just remember these are the 2 candidates who are major candidates. And then cartoon showing Bryan holding this cross of gold, basically saying that the average American who is going to be crucified on a cross of gold, because gold-backed currency will not lead to inflation, and it's going to be damaging for the average person. It's only going to be good for the rich, basically, what he's talking about. But of course, Bryan is a Democrat, and as I said, Democrats really don't win. You only have Grover Cleveland in this long stretch of time over the decades since the Civil War. So Republicans are able to control the White House for all these decades, and in the end, McKinley will win this election, backing a gold standard. Certainly, silver had been an important part of the nation's currency. In the 1870s, or at least by the 1880s, you definitely see there was even laws passed by Congress where a certain amount of silver was purchased every year as by the mint to mint coinage. And you see a lot of silver dollars that were minted by the government in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, and in the early 20th century as well. So it was in this election of 1896 that the People's Party, now back for their second presidential election, makes a fatal mistake. They don't back. This actually should say for vice president. I think it was maybe a misprint. But they don't back a candidate for president. They do back a candidate for president, but not their own separate candidate. They back Bryan, the Democrat. So they only back a separate guy for vice president who's a party member. And that proved to be a huge error because all those people, the million people that had voted for the People's Party back in 1892, many of them say, well, there's no sense for me to vote for the People's Party this time because we're actually not supporting a separate candidate. So I'm just going to vote with the Democrats and vote for Bryan. So it actually leads to the collapse of the People's Party when the election is over with. So the People's Party only was around for this very short period of time. They exerted a great deal of political control, really, in this period of the 1890s, but then that was it. As the economy recovers in the next year or so, and then you'll just again see the Democrats and the Republicans being the now having to worry about this third party. So there's McKinley, the winner. We'll be seeing and hearing more about him coming up in another chapter because, of course, he will be the president during the time that we have the war with Spain down in Cuba. All right, so what I'm going to do for the remainder of the class period is I'm going to talk about the World's Fairs of the 19th century and give you a little bit of background history of why there were World's Fairs, where they came from, and then talk about the two major World's Fairs that were held here in the United States at the end of the 19th century, in the last quarter of the 19th century. So, this is Joseph Paxton. He actually is the architect for the first World's Fair, the building that it was housed in. The brainchild, the idea for a World's Fair actually was that of Prince Albert, who was the husband of Queen Victoria of England. So the very first World's Fair was held back in 1851 here in this building in Hyde Park in London, England. And Joseph Paxton, by the way, was actually a well-known gardener. He ran a major, he was in charge of the grounds of a famous English country house known as Chatsworth in northern England. And so essentially all he did was design a gigantic greenhouse. But it's quite a remarkable building. It's actually very much a building of the Industrial Revolution. It's all cast in iron, so everything is precast and cut to the specific sizes that were needed. The glass is all cut. It was able to be assembled quite easily. And it was built to accommodate many of the large full-grown trees that were in the park so that they didn't have to be cut down, because they knew that once this exhibition was over with, the building would be taken down, and they didn't want to lose all these large trees in the park. So here in this painting, we can actually see how that worked. This large central portion of the building was put in a way so that they didn't have to cut down these giant trees here. So it was a way that England could demonstrate to the world its success. It was, of course, the wealthiest, most powerful nation on the planet in the mid-19th century. They controlled so many colonies around the globe that it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. So, when it was held, they also invited other nations. It was a way that nations could diplomatically share their culture with each other. So Britain was able to both show off to the world about its accomplishments, but other nations were able to come to show off their accomplishments. And the United States participated and did quite well, although the part of the building that we were in, we were a bit too ambitious. Apparently, there was a lot of space, but not enough stuff to fill it up. So the Brits kind of made fun of us initially. But in the end, there was a great deal of interest in some of the things that were being shown off, like Cyrus McCormick's Reaper, which was this invention that could harvest vast amounts of wheat. No longer would have to be done by hand. And so that was really regarded with a great deal of interest. Samuel Colt's revolver spurred a great deal of interest as well. There was actually so much interest in it that when the fair was over with, the British government commissioned a special committee to look into why the Americans were able to produce such high-quality firearms and why the British were so far behind what we were doing. So that was another thing that we were able to show them that we were doing better than they were. And there's actually the lock manufacturer from New York that was able to produce a special key that could pick this, had been thought to be an unpickable lock. So there was even a poem written about America's participation at the fair in 1851, talking about Yankee Doodle coming to town and basically being laughed at. If you see in the beginning there, everybody ran him down and laughed at his position. But then they began to take notice of things like your gunsmiths of their skills may crack, but not, again, don't mention. I guess it's Colt's revolvers whack. They're very few, the very first invention by Yankee Doodle to your beat. So they're saying that we, the Yanks, are beating the Brits. And then they're talking down here about this special lock that nobody thought could be picked was the Chubbs and Brahms lock. And so then at the end they're saying how as having been and you must now be viewed all as having been completely licked by glorious Yankee Doodle. So we might have arrived at the fair as a laughingstock, but when it was over with, everybody really realized that United American industry was really something to be worried about, that we were going to be challenging the British. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So, now, the United States actually did hold a fair in New York City only 2 years after the one in Britain, and it was actually quite similar. It hasn't gotten as much notoriety or exposure. It's actually thought that the later fairs, certainly the later fairs, that are considered to be much more important historically. So those are the ones I'm going to talk about. First, the 1876 World's Fair, which was the Centennial Exposition. And at the Centennial, the United States was celebrating its 100th birthday. And remember, this has just opened at the time, around the time that of the Battle of Little Bighorn out in Montana, and then all the bad news was filtering in about the defeat of the 7th Cavalry. but this is the cover of a popular magazine from the late 19th century, Frank Leslie's, and it was a special edition on the fair. And on first glance, it looks like just a pretty picture. You can see it's a lot of stuff going on. You can see here the railroads and the steamships are transporting people and goods, major point of things that we've been studying lately. American cities are growing. Here you see the United States Capitol in its completed state. It's only been completed for a little over 10 years with the great cast iron dome on top of it. And then this building actually back here is the main building at the fair. Now this fair did not just have one building, it had many pavilions. And the main building was the size of 6 football fields. And it was the largest building covered by one roof on the planet at that time. So it was really seen as being this great marvel to go see at the time. And the painting itself might just, with these figures, might just look like, isn't that really colorful, very late 19th century. That age is often referred to as the Victorian age. We refer to it by the reign of Queen Victoria, even though we're here in America. There's different terms, of course, you can use. The Gilded Age, which is a period of great prosperity and wealth being created, but it's just gilding is just a coating, and underneath there's something lesser there, a lesser metal, and of course lots of problems. On the surface, America looks like everything's going great, but as we know, there's all these problems. So anyway, from what you know about life and the way that the WASPs were thinking in the late 19th century, do you have any thoughts about how the artist portrayed these figures? Any ideas? So who's this? Okay, this is representation of America, right? And then, of course, it's probably a little bit more difficult here, being Americans, of who this other figure is. But can you see she's holding this shield with the lions on it? So the lions, a symbol of Great Britain. So this is Britannia, who represents the personification of Great Britain. And then, of course, the crown jewel in the British Empire is what colony? Like 19th century. Everybody knows this subcontinent in India. So here's India, but what's the difference between Britannia and the symbol of America here and India? What's the difference between the way they're standing? There's clearly a difference, yeah. Right, she's like sort of referring to Britain, right? She's kind of she's bending over, almost bowing to America and Britain. So she's not quite standing as tall as the other two are. And then clearly, Britain has lots of colonies in Africa. So clearly this African-American man, he's kneeling at the feet of Britannia. And on the other side, of course, what's the Native American doing? The same thing, kneeling at the feet of America. So very much those ideas that we've learned about with social Darwinism as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants being on top and other cultures and races being underneath. Very much portrayed in what at first glance is just this, what you might just think, oh, isn't that a nice picture? So here is the opening of the fair in Philadelphia. The fair was held in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, where, of course, the Declaration of Independence was written, and we declared our independence back in 1776. And, of course, the Constitutional Convention was held there in 1787. So the ideal place to hold this fair. And for the United States to show off to the world that it's the newest industrial power. I think that's quite important to note as well. we're doing this to really show off, just like Britain had done 25 years earlier. And this photograph is taken on the day when it opened. 150,000 people came out to see the opening of the fair. It was a horribly rainy day. You can see all these umbrellas. The President and Mrs. Grant came to open the fair, and the Emperor and Empress of Brazil came all the way from Brazil for this event. They had been touring around before the fair opened. Actually met Alexander Graham Bell at the School for the Deaf, where he was teaching as well. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So members of Congress, the Supreme Court, important state officials as well were all there for the opening. And this building, if you were to go to Fairmount Park in Philadelphia today, actually is still standing there. It's the only major building of the fair still left. The main building, unfortunately, was later taken down. But this is it, the largest building on Earth at the time, where many of the great wonders of the age would have been displayed. Corporations displaying their wares, states showing off their wares as well. But there was also on the fairgrounds, this is one of the entrances to the main building, there was also on the fairgrounds smaller pavilions. So states or countries could build small little buildings to display whatever they chose to. And actually, one of the few other buildings that's left on the grounds was built out of stone by the Ohio Stone Quarry Association, something like that. And so it's in pretty bad shape, but it's still there. And clearly probably because it was built out of such a durable substance that for whatever reason they decided not to take it down. A lot of times, like the state of Michigan had their own pavilion, and it would be disassembled at the end of the fair and then put in storage and then put up again if there was another fair somewhere else. So that was not uncommon to happen. So it was a vast space inside. Companies like telegraph companies or major corporations, whoever wanted to rent space could have had space there. Alexander Graham Bell had his display of his telephone actually somewhere up here. He had a little table up in one of these little galleries upstairs, which would have been cheaper than having it on the main floor. What's that?
Why was it cheaper?
Well, because the main floors would get more attention, more people would be wandering around. Whereas if you had to go up different staircases to various areas that kind of, upstairs, it would not get as much attention because a lot of people just wouldn't have gone up there. So, Mark Twain actually went, the famous author, and Mark Twain went to the fair, and he thought he was going to be able to see everything in a matter of a few hours, and he became horribly discouraged and left and thought that it would take at least 2 or 3 days to see everything. I'm sure it would have taken actually a lot longer than that, because this is only one of several buildings that were built on the grounds, just very large buildings, let alone the smaller ones. And I can tell you a little bit about Bell and his experience, because Alexander Graham Bell, so he's had just submitted his patent for his telephone, and he had actually been working on a project for Western Union called the Harmonic Telegraph was one of their projects, and actually while he was working on that project, he gets the idea that you might be able to send more than just musical notes through a wire, like he was working on for Western Union. And he thinks that maybe you can send something very complex like the human voice. And but he didn't have a whole lot of backing. Certainly he had backing, but he doesn't have like the types of resources like Western Union, which was one of the wealthiest corporations in the country at the time. So Western Union had their big display on the main floor, and the Emperor of Brazil was there to see this display on that opening day, and Bell happened to be in the audience. And the emperor had met Bell, as I mentioned, and sees him in the audience and asks about what he was doing. And so Bell says, well, he's invented this device where you can talk through it and you can hear your voice on the other end. And so the emperor says, well, that's really interesting. I'd like to see this. And Elijah Gray, who actually was working on a telephone for Western Union, was up there on the platform with the emperor, so the story goes. And so Elijah Gray goes along, and Elijah Gray had submitted his patent on the same day to the patent office as Bell. But Bell got his patent there a few hours earlier than Elijah Gray. So you probably never heard of Elijah Gray before. And so they go, the emperor takes one end of the telephone, Bell takes the other end and goes down the hall, and the emperor gets all excited. He's listening to Bell. Bell was reciting some Shakespeare sonnets, and the emperor hands the telephone to Elijah Gray. And supposedly it's said that that's when Elijah Gray knows he's defeated, but technically not, because Western Union was this huge corporation, and they had lots of lawyers and lots of money, and they try to buy the telephone rights from Bell later on, and he refuses to sell. And then they try to sue him and say that they had invented it first, and they end up losing in court. So if you had gone to the fair in the summer of 1876, you could have gone up into this arm. Recognize that arm? It's a little bit out of context, but that arm of the Statue of Liberty. The nation of France had given it to the United States as our birthday present. Of course, France, we'd probably still be British citizens if it wasn't for the French, because it was their military might that helped us win the Revolutionary War. So they give us the Statue of Liberty, which takes about 10 years before it actually gets put up. And so this is actually a little booth where you could pay and go up into the arm and look around the fairgrounds. And you can see all these other pavilions on the fairgrounds. There were them old restaurants and beer halls, things like that as well, besides pavilions that countries and states would have set up. This was the horticultural hall, so you could have gone to see plants, learned about the latest methods in farming. That was part of it as well. A lot of new information is starting to come out at the end of the 19th century about better types of crops to grow or cattle to raise, and some people are interested in that. You might have learned about how to can. So modern canning had been developed over a decade earlier, but a lot of people really don't start finding out about it until about this time. And this is where many American housewives would have, if they had visited the fair, would have seen how that process worked, to be able to properly heat up jars and then create that vacuum seal to preserve food. So you start to see that being done more and more at home. It had been done on a larger scale. Troops of the Civil War actually ate a lot of canned food that was preserved like that, but not really till about this time that is it starting to be done at home. And so the fair was disseminating information like that. The great Corliss engine was displayed at the fair as the largest steam engine in the world, made by the Corliss Manufacturing Company of Providence, Rhode Island. And that was a huge attraction. People would come out in the morning to see it as it was being put to work, and then it would be stopped at the noon hour when everyone had their meal, and then it would be started up again. And this is actually a drawing from one of the commemorative books at the time, showing when the Emperor of Brazil was there and when it was being shown on that opening day. So, it was actually later, after the fair was over with, it was purchased by the Pullman Rail Car Company and brought to Chicago, Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, and used to power the plant there. Unfortunately, today, if you were to go to Pullman, all you would see were some giant bolts that were left from it and the giant cement pad on which it sat, because as other forms of power came about later on, they scrapped it, unfortunately. So, but to give you an idea of how big this engine was, it was weighed. It had a 56-ton flywheel that revolved without any noise or vibration at 36 RPM, so revolutions per minute, and it supplied 1,400 horsepower to all the machinery that was connected to it throughout the hall where it was displayed. So we'll move on to the World's Fair of 1893, and it's known as the World's Columbian Exposition, or the Chicago's World's Fair. Sometimes it's referred to as the White City, and it is often seen as being the greatest of all the World's Fairs held in the 19th century by the United States. It was actually somewhat contentious about where it should be. There was a lot of politics going on. Eventually, New York and Chicago are the two finalists, and Congress was the one to decide. And the businessmen of Chicago won out. And the businessmen of Chicago wanted to show off Chicago. Chicago is often seen as being the most modern city in the world. In the 1890s, it had recovered from the Great Fire of 1871. And so it's this great wonder of a modern city on the shores of Lake Michigan. And so the fair was supposed to be held in 1892 because Columbian, referring to Christopher Columbus, who it was the 400th anniversary of his sailing to the New World and his so-called discovery of the New World. Of course, there are lots of native peoples here who knew it was here already, but anyway, it doesn't happen until 1893 because Congress took so long, because then the businessmen of Chicago couldn't decide where it should be located. Businessmen on the north side thought it should be up there. On the west side thought it should be there. Those from downtown businessmen thought it should be somewhere near downtown in the lake, and that's actually where they did build it. Because it had access to the lake, you could arrive by steamer. It was close to downtown, so you could take rail cars. It was a beautiful spot because you had all that water. So there was Chicago was built on marshes anyway. So they dug lagoons all through this property and canals, so you could take gondola rides. They brought in gondolas from Venice, Italy. So it was really quite extraordinary. And this is actually a map of the fairgrounds. And so by this time, World's Fairs, whether they were held in America or in Europe, had quite extensive fairgrounds. So no longer just one building or just a few buildings, but many, many buildings. So it would have to be on a large plot of ground, 100 acres or 80 acres, something like that. A lot of land. And so you can see here the waterways and lagoons. There were islands as well. It had its own railroad station, so you could take train cars directly to the fairgrounds. It had its own dock here where you could arrive by steamship. World's Fairs by this time had their own water sanitation often as well to ensure that the public would have safe water to drink. But it had something very important that was new that no other World's Fair had ever had before that. it had the Midway Palisades, or this short, the Midway. It actually will now inspire Midways, so if you ever go to a state fair or to a carnival and you like to play all those games on the Midway, well, this is the very first one. This is where it came from. And so this is all kind of the highbrow area, the main grounds, where you go see the national pavilions that the German government might build, and the large manufacturing buildings filled with American technology. But if you want to see about world culture, and you want to see how people live maybe in Bangladesh, they'd be like a village, a Bangladesh village. All kinds of nations from around the world often sent their people where they lived in their traditional villages. You could go to a German beer hall or get Wiener Schnitzel and have a pint of beer. You could ride a camel or an elephant. And so it was where all the fun was going on the Midway. And that's actually where they made their money, because all these attractions were a separate fee, just like if you were to go to Midway and play the games today. And so the businessmen of Chicago spend millions of dollars on building this temporary city is what they built. It's really an idealized city. This is the docks if you arrived on Lake Michigan. They wanted to make sure that they could recoup their money. And so this actually is a movable walkway, so quite advanced for 1893. Did have some technical problems, but nevertheless, people were quite amazed by it. Costs $2 a day to go to get a ticket, so it's quite expensive. It'd be like, for many people, spending your whole day wages just on going to the fair. And for some people, more than that. So I liken it to being like an expensive concert ticket. Here's a photograph of the main, I think this is called the Court of Honor. This is the administration building. The dome on the administration building is actually larger than the dome on the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. These buildings are built out of iron, and they may look like they're faced in stone, but they're actually faced in something called staff. And it's just a mixture of plaster of Paris and like straw material. This is the Statue of the Republic. Some of the great artists, the greatest artists in America of the day, all participated in this, and the great architects of the day. So all the major buildings are designed by the top architectural firms in the country, and all the great artists of the day have created the statuary that fill the fairgrounds. If you were to go to the fair, what had been the fairgrounds, it's a big, large park today, and all you would see were some roads and in this section, and there's like baseball diamonds and soccer fields. And there's a big traffic circle right here where the administration building was, and this statue of the Republic now sits on that site. Yeah?
Wait, so when the World Fair is done, what do they do with all the buildings?
Yeah, they usually just get demolished. Now this fair, the people of Chicago just thought they were the most extraordinary buildings ever. And some of them survived. There's one that survived, the Museum of Science and Industry. Is actually one of the buildings. It was the art museum at the fair. That survived. It was faced later on in stone. If you're lucky, sometimes there'll be one or maybe two that survive, but usually most of them just get torn down. Yeah, so it was a lot of money, millions of dollars that were paid. This is the manufacturing building, Liberal Arts and Manufacturing Building. It was designed by an architect called George B. Post. And it was the largest building in the world in 1893. So.
I've been inside the
Liberal arts?
No, the Chicago Science Museum.
Oh, yeah.
And I did not know it was
From the fair?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Museum of Science and Industry is pretty cool. I was there a few months ago, and they have a special display. I don't know if it's permanent or just temporary, but they had about the building and the fair. can find things all over the country nowadays from the fair. This is actually in the arches of the Liberal Arts and Manufacturing Building, the largest building in the world, in the entrance arches. And they were a set of 6 murals. The University of Michigan owns 2 of them, and they're in the graduate library at the University in Ann Arbor. So I'm always discovering, every once in a while, new things that you can find. Museums have them. Actually, those murals were done by a Michigan artist named Gary Melchers. Just another view of the administration building and the fairgrounds. The Egyptian pavilion inside one of the large buildings. I can't recall offhand which one it was, but here's the Egyptian pavilion. And it was inscribed on the side of the building from from the oldest nation in the world to the newest nation in the world. We send you morning greetings. Yes, Nina?
Do we still do world exhibitions?
There are. There was one in Italy about 3 or 4 years ago. There was one in like Uzbekistan or somewhere, Kazakhstan. I can't remember. One of the stands a few years ago, or maybe a year ago. It's not very long, very recently. Yeah, they're usually, it depends, every 2, 3, 4 years. There was one in Spain in the 90s. Milwaukee, oh no, I think it was Minneapolis. I just read in my news feed about a month ago. I think it was Minneapolis wanted to hold one coming up in like 10 years, and they had applied to see if they could get picked. It's sort of like the Olympics, I guess. Like there's a committee that decides where it's going to be held, and they lost out. So I thought, but because there hasn't been one here in the United States since the 1980s. Has anyone ever gone to Disney and gone to Epcot Center, maybe when you were a kid at all? No? Well, if you ever go to Epcot Center, it's basically the 1980s Disney kind of idea of a permanent World's Fair. You could have rode around the fairgrounds on this. It's actually recreated, but it's a recreated 1890s recreation of about an 1831 locomotive. So you could have ridden on that, which is actually in the collection at the Henry Ford Museum today. Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, 2 rivals in the electric field, vied for to get to light the World's Fair, because the entire fair was lit by electricity. No other fair had ever been lit like that before, and this was the first time that many people would have seen the electric light bulb. That's when they came to New York, especially if they had lived in rural areas. And nobody would have ever seen anything like it, because all the buildings inside and outside were lit with electric light bulbs. And George Westinghouse got the contract, actually. Him and his employee and great mind, Nikola Tesla, who perfects AC power. So it's lit with AC power, actually convincing people that AC power is the way to go over Edison's DC power. And so there's actually the electric wars that would go on at this time, in which Edison goes around electrocuting animals with AC power, trying to say how dangerous electricity is. Of course, DC power is dangerous too. And Edison even electrocutes an elephant at one point, and an elephant that had killed its trainer that was going to be put to death. And invents the electric chair to show how dangerous AC power is. But Edison, in the end, still lost the electric war. Edison's plants would have had been built closer together, and so that was a problem. Whereas AC power, you can send the current over high voltage lines over long distances. It's much more practical. And so here's Edison and his General Electric displays at the ground. This is a big music box, actually, and it's all lit with different colored light bulbs, and the lights pulsate according to the music that was set. So people were completely amazed by this as well. So you could have ridden on the Ferris wheel, and The great Ferris wheel was one of the great wonders of the age. It was built to be like in the World's Fair only a few years earlier in Paris when the Eiffel Tower had been built. And the fair organizers wanted to have something of that magnitude, a really huge, giant something, but they just didn't know what. Eventually, this engineer from Pennsylvania proposes to build this contraption in which you could hold dozens of people. Literally, these cars are as big as this classroom, and it would revolve. And it was actually rejected twice before they finally agreed to let him try to build it. And it cost something like $600,000 to build. It takes about 4 months to build. It was really quite extraordinary they were able to build it so quickly. And people were just amazed by it. Every car had an attendant, the windows were screened, and the door was locked. And the fair organizers were determined that no hysterical woman would throw herself out of it, because I think I told you that one day, this is the time when women suffer from hysteria, and because I think primarily because of the oppressive society that they lived in, and so they were determined that that was not happen. But it was a really great attraction, and people loved going on it. But it was kind of expensive. It cost 50 cents to take a ride. This is a photograph that was taken at night, just showing the amount of electricity that there actually was at the fair. So nobody had ever seen anything like that before. And this is actually promoting the City Beautiful movement. This is showing what urban planning can do. You know, remember, American cities at this time are so filthy and dirty and overcrowded. And so millions of people visit the fair, obviously many of them important politicians, and they go home to their states and to their cities and they say, we need to try to do something. We need to try to emulate what they were doing at the fair. You could rent what they call lolling chairs. They were wheelchairs. You could actually rent caravan chairs where they would carry you around, an attendant in the front and the back, like they used to carry around the Maharaja or the Pope or something. And those were available as well. There was supposed to be an electric bus. It had been built to take people around the fairgrounds as well. But unfortunately, it burned down in a warehouse fire where it was being stored shortly before the fair opened. Or it would have been the first time that people actually had a ride in an automobile. So, could go on a balloon ride on the Midway. You could go to the Ho-Ho Den, which was the Japanese pavilion on one of the islands. Unfortunately, it was burned at the time of World War II. It survived on the fairgrounds until the 1940s when an arsonist burned it down, which is really a shame because it's actually seen as being where the American modern architecture movement began. Because the architects of Chicago and from around the country visited this, and they were just amazed by the simplicity of Japanese architecture. And they start to incorporate some of those ideas in their designs. You could see little Egypt dance her Dance of the Thousand Veils, or the Kuda Kuda dance, as they called it. And they even wrote a special song for it. And it went like this, do 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 do, which of course people still would recognize, I think, today. Did you ever hear that before? Okay. So this was horribly controversial at the time. The wives of the men who put the fair on, all these wealthy millionaires who built this fair, they were horrified by this, and because of Victorian women dressed extremely conservatively, and so to see a woman's ankle was considered to be erotic in those days, let alone her entire form and midriff. So, but it proved to be extremely popular with the men who visited the fair. So,
That's how. I think that's how.
This is the This is the, I think it's the Bangladesh Pavilion, a photograph of that. The Lapland village, in which people lived in their grass huts throughout the summer and fall of 1893, spring, summer, and fall. It closed on Halloween, actually, on October 31st. It was the very last day of the fair. November 1st, 1893 was the last time the grounds were lit, where it wasn't open, but people came out just to see it from a distance lit. There was supposed to be, on the last day of the fair, there was supposed to be a reenactment of Columbus landing on the shores of, I guess, Hispaniola, where in the Caribbean. But because there was actually a replica of the Nina Pinta and the Santa Maria that had been built, and you could tour it. There was a dock there on the shores of Lake Michigan. But they were going to have this whole recreation with actors dressed like Columbus and his crew. And unfortunately, the mayor of Chicago was murdered just a few days earlier by a crazed office seeker who burst his way into the mayor's house and murdered him as he was eating his dinner. And so there was actually had a funeral the last day of the fair, this huge funeral in the streets of Chicago. And so all the festivities were canceled, unfortunately. Mayor Harrison, by the way, who was the mayor who had spoken at the Haymarket Square just before the bomb was thrown into the square and killed all those police and strikers only a few years earlier. So, you saw this before, but of course part of the Michigan display. And what you didn't see before was another part of the Michigan display, the Great Garland Stove. It's carved out of oak, and it was part of the Michigan Stove Company's display and other manufacturers. Michigan was the 8th largest producer of cast iron stoves in the late 19th century. And so we had a very large display there. And this is how it looked about 15 years ago after it had been restored and placed on the grounds of the Michigan State Fairgrounds. But unfortunately, a few years ago, lightning struck it, and that's what happened to it. So after surviving since the 1893 World's Fair, it got struck by lightning and it's destroyed. So if you were to go to the fair in 1893, there would be things that you would recognize from today. There would have been Cracker Jacks at the White City that you could have bought. You could have had a beer from Pabst because they won a blue ribbon and they decided to name their beer Pabst the Blue Ribbon beer. It's from this fair. And so that was one of the things. You could have had pancakes. The first time Aunt Jemima pancake syrup was introduced to the public was at this fair. Cream of wheat and shredded wheat breakfast cereals were introduced to the American public, those brands of that cereal. Juicy fruit gum was introduced at the fair as well. And diet carbonated soda for the first time appears as well. So if you were watching your weight, you could have gotten a diet soda. So anyway, that was the World's Fair, and there were some pretty interesting fairs that were held actually later on as well in the 20th century. So, but if you've seen the tire on I-94, that was a Ferris wheel at the 1964 New York World's Fair, in which it was a Ferris wheel in the center part where the tread is. So anyway, that's all the time I have for you today, but I'm going to talk about the Gilded Age and the way that the 1% lived on, what's today?
Good luck with today's lesson.